Simon Parkin.
BBC Radio Somerset.
14 minutes past one. Now, when you get an email that claims to be one of the most fascinating characters of Tudor times that most people have never heard of, but should have, well, you just want to find out more. Tim Darcy Ellis has written a new book. It's called The Secret Diaries of Juan Luis Vives, who was a Jewish Spaniard, fled Spain to avoid the Inquisition, became a tutor for Henry VIII's daughter, got caught up in the divorce feud between Henry and Catherine of Aragon, tucked Catherine inside, but still managed to escape with his life. It's such an interesting story. So Tim is a historian. He's also written this book, it's sort of a fictionalised version of real events. And he lives in Australia, so I had to record with him so that the time worked for both of us. And when we got through, the first question that I had to ask was, who precisely was Juan Luis Vives?
Well, he was a great scholar and academic who was born in Valencia in 1492 to a Jewish family that had been forced to convert to Christianity. 1492 was the year that it became illegal to be a Jew in Spain under the decree of Alhambra of the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. So his family were put in this sort of difficult position of either having to leave Spain or convert to Christianity. And his family came from a very long line of wealthy wool merchants and academics and legal people on his mother's side. And he had a very good education in Spain. But as the Inquisition was heating up, everything was tightening up and getting more and more difficult for his family, he decided to leave when he was 16 in 1509 to Paris. And he furthered his education at the Sorbonne, became well acquainted with a lot of the great men of his time, like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Sir Thomas More. And he wasn't afraid to start a line of communication with people such as the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and ingratiated himself with these people to the point that they would become his patrons. And then he was invited to the English court of Henry VIII to tutor Princess Mary. And it was there really that he started writing what was quite revolutionary prose about the way he saw society needed to go in terms of he was a great pacifist and he was a great advocate for the equality of women, way ahead of his time, the education of women, and for a sort of national health service so that the care of the sick and even the mentally ill would be taken care of by the state and not left to the charity of the church. So he was really one of the great men that history has sort of forgotten.
Well, you make that point that he is, the person that probably most people have never heard of but should have. And that being ahead of his time right at the end of the book, you've got a quote that he said in 1525, it ought to be the duty of the public officials to take pains to see that men help one another, that no one is oppressed, no one wronged by an unjust condemnation, and that the strong come to the assistance of the weak in order that the harmony of the united body of citizens may grow in love day by day and enjoy forever. I mean, that's something that could be said today.
Isn't it? It's a wonderful quote. And I really feel that he was 500 years ahead of his time. And he had the ability to sort of sit back and look at where people were and where society was. And he saw all around that the church was advocating for peace and love, but actually was persecuting people being in religious minorities. And his own family suffered grievously at the hands of the Inquisition. His father was arrested when Vives was 7. There was a lengthy trial. He was eventually executed by burning at the stake. His mother, who had died a natural death, had been reported retrospectively of having visited a clandestine synagogue, and so her body was actually unearthed. There was a trial held for a dead woman, and her remains too were burnt at the stake and ploughed into the soil. So he came from this background of terrible events that were happening to him and his family, and similar things happened to aunts and cousins, brother-in-law. And yet he had that ability to step back and say, okay, don't give in to the bitterness, don't fight fire with fire. but love your neighbour and live by those true sort of ideologies of what he felt was the true message of religion. I think he was one of the great men that, for various reasons that we can go on to discuss, has been forgotten by history.
It's a lovely device you've taken with the book, and it opens with a builder putting a hole in a wall and finding the secret diary. Why did you want to do it like this?
I wanted to give him a voice. So it is his diaries, but I needed to find a device whereby that might sound authentic. And we have several events that we know actually occurred. We find in England quite often in the priest houses of the 17th century, the priest holes, and hidden in walls and underneath floorboards, we find the sort of secret writings of the Catholic priests and the Catholic families that didn't want to be discovered by the Elizabethan regime or that of James I, who, ultra Protestant. We also know that in Norway during the Second World War, Torah scrolls from synagogues were hidden under floorboards and in walls in synagogues. So I felt that there was some plausibility to the story. And I just wanted to get an in that the modern reader could relate to and, get an into the story that I thought would be quite catchy and quite hooky. Yeah.
And it is a story, though it's based on real events. How difficult was it to sort of merge your imagination with what you knew actually happened?
Well, it took a great deal of research, and I was actually in no rush to write this book, but I needed to make sure. So if they were in Greenwich in 1522 at the palace, that if I was setting a scene there with the royal family, that the royal family were there at the time. He was great friends with Thomas More, and then halfway through the book, the More family moved from Bucklersbury, which was in the city of London, to Chelsea. So I needed to make sure that those scenes where the More family were involved were in the right place at the right time. And all that took an awful lot of work because we obviously have historic fiction novels, and I live in Australia. So getting to libraries, looking up sources, looking at stuff online actually was quite challenging. But I was really exact in making sure that everything that is in the book could have happened. Of course, I've given Vives a voice, which is what I wanted to do because we have his academic writings, but not much of his own emotional, heartfelt voice. But certainly that the historic places, times, events are accurate as far as we can tell.
And the cast of characters, these are names that I remember from my history lessons, and most of them I kind of couldn't quite remember why I remembered them from my history lessons. So Sir Thomas More, as you mentioned, also you've got Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, you've obviously got Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and what a fascinating life he obviously lived.
He did, and I really wanted to tell the life. We often hear that story of the Tudor narrative from the viewpoint of Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn or Thomas Cromwell as in Hilary Mantel. But when we see non-English people, I think as English or part of the Anglosphere, we often see those characters as a little bit suspicious, a little bit dark. They're sort of plotting in the background. They're generally not to be trusted. They wear very black clothes. And I wanted to tell that story of what it was like coming into the Tudor court from the outside in, and not coming from that sinister perspective. And so I wanted to give views of those characters from an outsider's point of view. But also I needed to bring into the story all those people that the English reader is going to know very well from childhood and from history lessons at school and from the major films and the Tudors that we can see on Netflix. So that, again, the reader could relate to the events of the book.
And Vives was there during the divorce feud of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And what I loved about it was that Henry VIII, who I sort of imagine as being a very scary figure, and all of his lifestyle changes and the changes to the world he brought in to fit with them, he comes across as actually being quite broad-minded and quite all right. And even though we know that Vives took Catherine's side, Henry didn't have him beheaded, he didn't have him executed.
No, and I think Vives was very clever. He played that game very skillfully. Before he came to England, he actually dedicated a book to Henry VIII. And so he really worked on that relationship. And it was quite interesting. I think that Henry had a great deal of admiration for Vives's scholarship and his familiarity with the Bible texts. And so when he was considering the case for a divorce from Catherine, he consulted Vives to look at that sort of difference between the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy in terms of how can I justify a divorce. So Henry lent on Vives. Once Vives had got himself ingratiated with the English court, He was quite outspokenly critical of Henry at times. He said to him, beware of your arrogance. You too could end up in the prison that the King of France was in at that time. He was temporarily imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor. So he kind of stood up to Henry. And we know Vives as the godfather of psychoanalysis. He loved sitting back and watching people. He loved observing human nature, body language, mood, and effect. So I have him there psychoanalyzing Henry VIII and really trying to get to know him from the inside out, which sounds really 20th, 21st century stuff. But actually, Vives was the first person to really write about. He didn't use the word psychoanalysis, but that sort of idea of psychoanalyzing somebody that you're working with and that you're getting to know. And I also think that Vives was really looking for, he was a great pacifist and anti-persecution because of what happened to him and his people. Henry was quite sympathetic towards Jewish people. We don't often read about that because Jewish people don't crop up in the Tudor narrative very often. But I have Vives in the novel trying to really negotiate with Henry to open England up to the Jews who were fleeing the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. So he had a good relationship with Henry, but ultimately he had to choose who he was going to side with in the royal divorce. And he decided to side with Catherine in the end, which led to his arrest and imprisonment. But again, he was able to get himself out of that situation by this sort of careful and skillful oratory.
I mean, what a fascinating man. When you did all of your research, and you obviously knew quite a lot of the story anyway, what caught you by surprise? What were you not expecting to find out that you did?
I found that so many things that we now talk about, he was talking about in those days. And when we look at his views on the psyche, he mentioned, he didn't use the word addiction, but he was talking about people that had habits that were very self-destructive. And what do you do if you are suffering from a habit or something that you can't stop doing that is causing the ruination of your life, such as alcoholism, I guess he was alluding to, or perhaps gambling. And so he said that if you suffer from this kind of malady and it's your greatest passion, you need to replace that with another passion. It's no good just letting that go. You've got to replace that with something that you can be equally passionate about, that's going to be less harmful. And he also spoke about, and again, didn't use these words, but post-traumatic stress disorder, and how somebody who'd suffered trauma as a child, which indeed he had by seeing these inquisitorial autos de fe where there were burnings at the stake, how like a smell of burning or a sight of something that was there could trigger a somatic reflex in the body, and the person could go into that trauma response. So towards the end of my research, I found out more about what he was saying about psychology, or we would call it psychology now. And I just found that extraordinary that 500 years ago, literally it's 500 years ago, he was writing about such things.
I also found it quite fascinating as well, with the undercurrent being that he was secretly Jewish and always on edge. And there's one bit where someone says, "Oh, you got the nose of someone who's Jewish," and that whole living a lie must be such a bizarre thing to go through whilst you are changing the world as he was.
Absolutely. And we have many, many stories of people at this time who are leading a very, very convincing double life. And there was a well-known Jewish female businesswoman, Doña Gracia de Mendez, and she actually got married in the Cathedral of Lisbon. And then eventually she got out of Portugal. She came to England in the 1530s, then she went to Antwerp. All the time she was being accused of Judaism and secret Jewish practice, and she was denying it, saying, no, these ones are Jews, those ones are Jews, but I'm not a Jew. Eventually she got out to Ferrara, where it was safe to be Jewish, and then on to Constantinople. And she came out at the end saying, yes, I've always been a Jew, I had the wood on you people. So people were definitely living a double life. But I think what happened with Vives, instead of things getting better in the later part of his life for Jews, they got worse. So actually in the 1530s, there was sort of an increase in the powers and reach of the Inquisition, and they were getting beyond Spain. They were getting to Belgium and Flanders and the Low Countries. And so although he was a great proponent and he attacked the Inquisition, and he wasn't frightened to write directly to the Pope and tell him what he needed to do to stop the Inquisition from happening. In his lifetime, he couldn't see that manifest. And so he was denying his Judaism right through to the end. And it's quite interesting that he was actually banned by the Pope. His writings were banned by the Pope sometime after he died in 1540. And then he faded from the record in the Spanish tradition. And he was rediscovered in the 19th century in Spain, but people didn't realize he was Jewish. It wasn't finally shown that he was Jewish until 1964, when the inquisitorial records that condemned his parents were actually discovered. So he did a very, very good job of keeping his Jewish history secret.
It's great the way that you've done his diary. Wouldn't it be lovely, though, if a real diary turned up and we could get the actual thought?
Wouldn't it? Yes. That's a really interesting proposition. I hadn't thought of that. Well, let's hope it happens so that we can compare both.
And let's hope it happens way after your book has kind of had its moment in the sun. We don't want it being usurped.
No, I couldn't agree with you more.
A lovely man. What an interesting story. Secret Diaries of Juan Luis Vives by Tim Darcy Ellis. It's BBC Radio Somerset, 1:30 London.